Hey guys, so not too long ago, I decided to update a video that I made a few years ago, that being my top 10 worst players of the new era. And to continue with that, I decided to update another video that I made alongside that, that being my top 10 best players of the new era. And obviously, now I'm going to be updating it 2 years later, following Survivor 48. And I found this to be a very interesting process to do, and this is obviously going to be a very different list compared to what I did last time due to the inclusion of new players, but also some reassessment of players that were on the previous list. Spoke at that soon enough. But before we get into the actual top 10, I have a very long list of honorable mentions here. And first up, I want to talk about the people who were on the original top 10 who have since been kicked off due to the inclusion of new players. And it ended up being most of the people who were on the original list, to where only 3 of the people who were on the original top 10 are still on the top 10. But first up, we do have Erica, who was originally number 10, and truth be told, my assessment of Erica has gone up over time, and I did consider having her in the new top 10 with that assessment, but at the end of the day, I feel like it was just really hard to squeeze her on, especially with the inclusion of these new players, so wasn't quite good enough to make it there. Next up, we have Cody, who was number 9 on the original list, and I still think Cody is a good player for the most part, and I think he's someone who still has a lot of potential to become a better player if he were to come back and develop more of a killer instinct, though at the end of the day, it was still kind of hard to squeeze him on, as I still think he's a bit too loyal and someone who I think was a bit too big of a target by the time he went out, so wasn't quite enough to make the list for me. Next up, we have Matthew from 44, who was number 8 on the original list, and straight up, he should not have even been on the original list, as I assessed him way too highly on that, especially with stuff that we learned from after the season, where supposedly he was this pretty massive threat and someone who wasn't as well positioned as it seemed at first, and someone who probably would have been an early merge boot even if he hadn't had to leave the game. But Matthew is someone who was always going to be kicked off on this list whenever I did it again, but especially now with the inclusion of new people, it was just very hard to put him on, and it's kind of funny that he was even on the list to begin with, but now he's no longer on the list. Next up, we have Shane from 41, who was number 7 on the original list, and I actually did for a moment consider keeping her on, simply because I did find it impressive how she was able to dominate the Ua tribe, how she was able to get to the final 2 of that tribe without ever being targeted, and she was essentially the leader of her alliance during the early merge. However, at the end of the day, I feel like it's pretty hard to have her on when she's only 8th place on the season, and I still think she did plenty of wrong to make herself the target, where she had targeted Nasir at the split trial beforehand, and obviously was just way too big of a target by the time she went out, so at the end of the day, it was kind of hard to have her on the list, but I still think her run on 41 is at least somewhat impressive there. Next up, I did have to remove Ricard, who was number 6 on the original list. And again, a lot of this is due to the inclusion of other people. Now, I still think Ricard is a pretty good player in the grand scheme of things, where I feel like he's pretty good strategically, pretty good physically at points, and obviously socially, like, he's fine, but not the greatest in the world. But at the end of the day, I feel like it was just kind of hard to squeeze him on, especially with him only being 5th place. And while it's impressive that he pulls the trigger on Chan at the final 8, he also did it in a way to where it was pretty much impossible for him to get all the way to the end unless he won out, where it seemed like while he was able to align with Heather and Erica and Xander, they were always using him as a shield, to where he was always going to be cut around the final 5, so kind of hard to squeeze him on because of that. Next up, we have Danny from 41, and admittedly my view of Danny has gone down a bit over time, as while I still think he is a pretty well-rounded player as a whole, I still feel like his game on 41 is probably not the greatest in the world, especially considering the fact that he does lose control at the final 8, and he's essentially someone who's barely scraping by through his final 2 rounds. And while he probably wins if he gets to the end, he was just pretty far off from actually getting there, so at the end of the day, it was kind of hard to fit Danny onto the list. And finally, and I'm actually surprised this person is no longer on the list, but I have decided to cut Omer. Now, I did very much consider keeping Omer on the list, as I feel like he's still a pretty solid player, someone who was able to have a decent amount of control across a lot of his season, though at the end of the day, he is still only 6th place. And even in his boot round, he did have an out in the sense that Lindsay could have used her amulet to save him there, and even beyond that, they had an idle nullifier that they could have used as well. So I do feel like Omer's someone who definitely had some outs within his boot round, but considering the fact that he's only 6th place, it was really difficult to squeeze him on, though I very much consider keeping him in. Next up, let's talk about the people who have played since me making my original list, that being Survivor 44, who I did consider but ultimately did not make it. Where first up, I did want to talk about Caleb from 45. Now, truth be told, Caleb wasn't really that close to making it to the list. However, I did want to at least mention him simply because Caleb has come up a lot in preseason interviews for people who have played since 45, as it does seem like a lot of people look at Caleb as this great player and someone who they want to model their game after. And I did want to at least mention that aspect to it, though at the end of the day, Caleb is still someone who really mismanaged his start level and someone who was probably going to have a very difficult time getting towards the end of the game. But considering just how much people have talked about him and considering how much he seems to have influenced future players, I did want to at least mention him, though obviously not someone who made the list. Next up, we have Emily Flippin, who was obviously a pretty big player in the season, though at the end of the day, she is way too high variance to make it on the list, where she was literally about to be the first boot on the season until Hannah Rose quit the game. And while she does have a pretty impressive run beyond that, where she's able to recover from being on the bottom and she's able to be included in the majority alliance after the merge, until she sniped out of the game at the final 7 due to an idle play, I still feel like Emily is someone who is a bit too high variance, where I feel like she's someone who's either going to be like this very early boot, or she'll make a deep run, but will eventually be sniped out due to her being this pretty big threat. And I do feel like even if she had survived the final 7 on her season, I don't think she gets towards the end, as I'm very inclined to think that Austin would have taken D to the end over Emily. Even Drew is someone who I think probably would have cut Emily if it came down to it. So at the end of the day, I feel like that was enough to leave Emily off the list. And speaking of which, I also wanted to mention Drew Basile, also from 45. And I think Drew played a pretty good game on the season, all things considered, where he was part of the majority alliance for most of his run, up until he gets taken out at the final 6. And a lot of him losing control of the game is due to the fact that Austin leaked the plan, and through that he ends up losing Emily at the final 7, which is a very unfortunate circumstance there. Though I think if we're looking at Drew as a player, I feel like Drew is probably not as well-rounded compared to Austin, where I think Drew is someone who we definitely saw get into confrontations with people, where we saw him get into arguments with Jake. Even on the swap tribe, we see him not having the greatest relationship with Brando, and that did cause Drew to be the target over Austin at that tribal that they went to. And while it's impressive that he's able to get Emily on their side, I would probably give Austin more credit for that. And I think on any given season, I wouldn't have as much faith in Drew as Austin, for instance, but I still think Drew is a fine enough player to where I did want to at least mention him. Next up, I did consider Maria from 46, as Maria is someone who was obviously a pretty big player on that season, where she worked with Charlie for most of that run, and she was in a pretty good spot for most of it. And it also seemed like she was the biggest jury threat by the time she went out, to where she probably beats everyone if she got to the final 3. So I do feel like Maria is definitely a pretty good player, especially for her archetype, though at the end of the day, I feel like Maria gets outplayed by Charlie at multiple opportunities, where while she is included in the +1 alliance right before the merge, that alliance just quickly crumbles, and from that point on, I feel like Charlie's in a better spot compared to her. Even before the merge, you have her not wanting to target Gem, but Charlie's able to get her to go along with his plan versus hers. And I do feel like even though she does try to flip the game on Charlie, Charlie is just way better equipped to take her out instead. So I feel like while Maria has a lot of win equity in the season, it was definitely a big player in the season. I feel like the fact that Charlie pretty consistently outplays her during the post-merge is a major reason why I did not go with her on the list. Next up, I also considered Kenzie the winner of the season, and obviously I did have to consider her simply because she won the game. And I do think Kenzie definitely has some decent skills from the game, though at the end of the day, I feel like Kenzie's someone who I don't have the most faith in to actually pull out a win on any given season, where I think for one, I think she struggles a bit with threat management, where we do see in the original Yanu that the likes of Jess and Banu were trying to throw her under the bus. I also think she gets kind of overrated as a social player, where while people prop her up as one of the greatest social players ever, and that's what gave her the win on 46, I don't think that's what gives her the win that season, where while the show tries to highlight her relationship with Ben and helping him through his panic attacks, we also see Ben being way closer to Charlie and getting to the point where Ben not only puts her in the fire instead of Charlie, but also would have voted for Charlie had it been a tie. And the fact that she only wins by 1 vote at the end, where that deciding vote was Maria. And I don't think Kenzie really did that much to get Maria's vote, where I feel like Maria was more so burned by the fact that Charlie voted her out. So I don't think Kenzie really does much to utilize her social game to win in that season. Though I still think she is a good enough social player to where she's able to remain pretty safe for a lot of that season. And I do think she is definitely someone that I would have at least some faith on any given season, though not to crack the top 10. Next up, we have Caroline from 47. And I talked pretty highly about Caroline's game at the time, and I still feel like Caroline played a pretty good game and definitely demonstrated some good skills for Survivor. However, I'm not entirely sure how consistent she would be on any given season, where I definitely think she gets helped out by the fact that she has someone like Gabe who was willing to take her under his wing for a lot of it, and that allowed her to really play under the radar for a lot of the season. And while she does get idled out of the game at the final 7, she also is only booted at the final 7. So I feel like when we're looking at the people who made the list, who made it much deeper than that, I feel like it's kind of hard to squeeze Caroline on, but I still feel like she's a pretty good player, all things considered. I also considered Andy from 47, and I think Andy is also a pretty solid player, someone who I think demonstrates a lot of skills for the game. He's obviously a massive super fan, and I think Andy's someone who I definitely think would know like what he should be doing, and I would have at least some faith in him to enact that, though I still think he's someone who could definitely get into trouble at points where we literally see him being on the bottom of the original Godhead tribe. He also has his meltdown on day 3, which obviously is not particularly great. And I also think Andy struggles with his perception as well, where obviously on 47, I think his win equity is definitely up in the air, and I'm not entirely sure how receptive people will be to a shtick on a lot of other seasons. But I still think Andy is someone who is an interesting player, and I would be fascinated to see how he does in return, but I feel like for now, it's not really enough to make the list for me. And also from 47, I did consider Sam, who I think played a pretty good game for the most part, where he obviously gets to final tribal. And I do think Sam is someone who I think I would have some faith in on any given season. Though at the same time, he also had a pretty rocky road during the mid game of 47, and obviously loses at the end despite him having this underdog story. But I still think Sam is someone who I would at least have some faith on any given season, though not enough to crack the top 10. Next up, jumping to 48, I did consider Joe. And Joe is someone who I thought was going to make the list when I was watching the season, largely because I thought he was going to win the game, and I feel like had he won the game, I feel like it would have been enough to crack the top 10. Now at the same time, Joe is someone who definitely demonstrated a lot of red flags, even during the season, where for one, he had pretty questionable jury management, where he would just preach on honor and integrity. Also the fact that he would just get paranoid at points, like during the Mary round. Also him just completely shutting out Shaheen during that round, getting tricked by Kyle and Camila to voting out Shaheen that spot. And obviously the fact that not every season is going to play out like this, where I feel like had he been on a more dynamic season like 47 or 46, that he probably would have been a clear target during the mid-merge. But he was still able to like build like a good enough alliance on this particular season. But instead, he ends up losing at the end, getting 3rd place, and supposedly he had pretty much no win equity on the season, where it seemed like he was going to lose against pretty much everyone, where he was even going to lose to Eva if that were final 2. So I feel like with that in mind, it is enough to knock Joe out, where I feel like considering the red flags that were there, considering that this was essentially one of his best case scenarios of being able to build this alliance that was able to remain loyal to him, the fact that he gets that and still loses at the end is a pretty bad sign for me. And again, mixing the fact that I feel like he's a pretty big target on a lot of other seasons that have more dynamic gameplay, I feel like those things are enough to where I couldn't justify putting Joe on the list. And the final honorable mention here is Eva, also from 48. And I think Eva has a similar issue to Joe in the sense that I don't think Eva is a particularly flexible player. I think she's someone who will largely just find her group and stick with it all the way through. And I think if she's on a season like 47 and 46, where there's a lot of flipping, I feel like at the point where she's on the bottom, I don't know how well she'll be able to recover from that. I think she's someone that needs to have a cast like 48, a cast that is less willing to flip against like their allies from early on. Though at the same time, I think Eva's also someone who's pretty well-rounded for the most part. I think she's pretty good physically, pretty good socially, and fine enough strategically to where I feel like she's able to at least make a deep run in most seasons. Though I think it's the lack of a killer instinct and the fact that I don't think she adapts well to adversity that makes it hard for me to put her on the list. But still, I think she's a fine enough player. So now that we've gone through all the honorable mentions, we have 10 players to get into, and let's waste more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 10, and I very much debated with this placement. I considered putting this person in the honorable mentions section. I considered putting someone else in this spot instead, as I feel this person is pretty borderline. However, after thinking about it, I decided to go with Camila from Survivor 48. And I think in a lot of ways, Camila is definitely on the same level as a lot of the other players we got into with the honorable mentions, people like Erica, for instance. And I still think there are issues to her game, like the fact that she wasn't in the core majority alliance during a lot of the post-merge, where she was more so working behind the scenes. Also the fact that she sucked at fire and didn't really have much of a path to the end, where it seemed like Kyle was always going to cut her. And really no one wanted to take her to the end due to the fact that she was such a big threat by the end of it. And in general, she was targeted at a few points during the post-merge. However, I think taking that stuff out, I still think Camila is a very skilled player for the game, where I feel like she's the type of player that would do pretty well on a more dynamic season of the show, a season that is definitely more in line with a lot of the more recent seasons like 46, 47, even 45. I think Camila would do very well on those seasons, but even on 48, the season that she was on, the season that was, for the most part, pretty stagnant and had a pretty solid majority alliance that never really turned on each other, with the exception of David, I still feel like Camila did pretty well within that, where despite her not being in the core group, she was able to have a good enough connection with Kyle and Shaheen to where she was able to remain pretty safe and was able to be in the loop for most rounds. And while she herself didn't drive a lot of the votes, where instead she was working alongside Kyle during a lot of the post-merge, I still feel like the fact that she was able to remain pretty safe, getting all the way to the Final Four before being in serious danger of going home, is pretty impressive in my eyes. Not to mention that she also pulled off the Thomas move at the post swap, where despite her being in a pretty bad spot post swap, she was able to completely trick the remaining loggies into thinking that them and Kyle weren't working together, and at the same time was able to avoid the target over Kyle, which I find pretty impressive there. And even in challenges, I feel like she wasn't a complete slouch either, where while she obviously sucked at the fire making challenge, she still won 2 immunities over the course of the season, which is pretty good there. So I feel like Camila is someone who I think has a lot of skills for the game. I feel like she's definitely the type of player that would do well in the new era. And while I could still see a world where she's like a bit high variance and could be in trouble early on if she's given the wrong starting tribe, I feel like Camila is the type of person that I think would do well, generally speaking, on any given season. And it'll be interesting to see how she's tested on Survivor 50, whether she'll be able to get past the first few rounds and play another good game. But for now, I'm going to leave her here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who I very much debated on, not only on whether to include them in the top 10, but also where on the top 10 to place them. However, at number 9, we do actually have the lowest placed finisher on the actual list, and here we have Genevieve from Survivor 47. And Genevieve is someone who I very much debated on. I feel like Genevieve has a lot of pros for her game. I think she also has some cons along the way where I still stand by some of the knocks that I gave to her on my 47 player ranking, namely the Saul move, where I still feel like that was a bit too early for her to make, and I feel like it just enabled the Tukus a bit more than she needed to and just made her a much bigger target than what she was coming into that round. And even beyond that, there were points where she didn't get her way. There were points where she was being targeted after that move. So again, I feel like there are definitely some knocks to her game there. But I still feel like Genevieve demonstrated a lot of skills for the game across her season, where I feel like she was very good at building allies during a lot of her season, where we see in the original Lavo that she was essentially in the middle of that tribe, where while she was shown working alongside Rome, using him as a smokescreen, she also was able to build a good enough bond with Asia and Teeny to where they thought that Genevieve was working alongside them. And even Keyshawn felt pretty good about Genevieve. So I feel like Genevieve really did a good job at making the rest of her tribe feel comfortable with her. And then even after the merge, while I still think she mismanaged her threat level there, she was still pretty effective at building numbers, where she was able to pull in Andy and Sam into the merge. She was part of Operation Italy, which is all pretty good. And in general, I feel like Genevieve is someone who I would have a lot of confidence in coming into any given season. And I think it'll be interesting to see how she does in Survivor 50, where I feel like that'll be a further test of her abilities there. So I do feel like Genevieve is someone who, while I think is a bit overhyped in the Survivor community, and while I think her game definitely has more knocks than people are giving her credit for, I still think she's a very strong player, and I still think she's someone who I definitely think is a worthy placement on this list. Though with that said, the reason she's not higher is she's only 5th place. And as a spoiler for the rest of the list, the rest of the players made it to at least the final 4. So I feel like with Genevieve only coming in 5th, I feel like that was a bit hard to justify her being higher, but I still think she's a pretty good player. And it's for that reason that she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have yet another person who I'm definitely higher on as a player than I am with their respective game, where I was very critical of this person's game while the season was happening, and while I still stand by that, I feel like they definitely demonstrate a lot of skills for the game across their season. But number 8, we have Rachel Lamont, the winner of Survivor 47. And Rachel's someone who I've already gone on and on about her winning game. I feel like it was a pretty bad one where she was pretty clearly on the bottom for a decent amount of it. I feel like she was also someone that kind of had to win out at the end, and also someone who didn't really have as much agency as I would have liked here. And again, I still stand by a lot of those issues, but despite that, I still think Rachel demonstrated a lot of skills for the game across her season, where I feel like she's good really at all 3 aspects of the game, where I feel like socially she is good enough at building bonds, and while it doesn't always translate to her being the majority, I feel like the fact that she was able to like build those connections with the likes of Saul and with Annika and Sierra, I think I have to give her some credit for that. Strategically, I feel like she's very capable. I feel like she's someone who knows the game pretty well. I feel like the way that she talked about the game on the On Fire podcast during Survivor 48 really demonstrates a good knowledge for the game. So I feel like that's pretty good. And obviously, physically, she's also pretty good. She won several challenges. I feel like she's someone who I think definitely has a lot of skills for the game on any given season. And the fact that she ends up winning the season, despite how rocky of a road she had, I think that definitely is something I had to give her some credit for in this ranking here. So I feel like Rachel's someone who, while I don't think her game fully demonstrates her abilities, I feel like she's someone who I think on any given season, I would expect her to do reasonably well, considering how good she is at each aspect of the game. And it's for that reason that she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the first of 3 people who were on the original list who are still here. And while I still think this person is very good, I feel like with the inclusion of other people, it did cause this person to drop slightly. But number 7, we do have Jesse from Survivor 43. And I still think Jesse is a very strong player. I think he's still someone who is very capable strategically and socially, where we saw him play a pretty strong game on Survivor 43, where he essentially dominated from beginning to end alongside Cody. And even within that, I still think there are plenty of impressive elements, like the fact that he wasn't really targeted at all before the final 6 when he makes his move against Cody. And even beyond that, the fact that Cody was so loyal to him to the point where Cody gave him his idol to hold on to for most of the game and was even able to get it back from Cody after he gave it to Cody at the final 6 round just to show to Carla. I feel like that shows a lot of skill on Jesse's end. And even beyond that, the fact that he actually pulls off the Cody move at the final 6, actually pulling the trigger on his closest ally, shows an ability that I think a lot of new era players are lacking, where I feel like we have seen so many cases of players sticking true to their closest ally, even if the win equity is questionable. I think the fact that Jesse actually has that killer instinct to take out his ally knowing that he would need to do so to win shows an ability that I think a lot of people on his top 10 are lacking. So I feel like that's pretty good. Though at the same time, it also elevates his threat level to where it makes it really hard for him to actually get to the end, to where we know from afterwards that he's not very good at challenges and he's not good at fire making. And obviously that does result in him being taken out at the final 4. And I still think that's a major issue with Jesse being higher, is the fact that I feel like he's not very good at challenges. And if he's at the point where he is being targeted, I'm not entirely sure he'll be able to get out of that situation. But regardless, I still think Jesse is one of the better players of the new era. I think he played a very impressive game on 43, definitely demonstrated a lot of social and strategic abilities for the game. And I think the fact that he has that killer instinct to do what is optimal for his game was a major reason why he is at least this high on the list, even though he is still one of these people that did not get to the end. So it's for that reason that I have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another person who was on the original list, and a player who I've compared a lot to Jesse, and here we have Carson from Survivor 44. And I feel like Carson and Jesse are around the similar level, where both of them played very impressive final juror games on their respective seasons, where they're able to play a dominant game strategically, but get cut right at the very end. And it's a debate that I still have with myself quite a bit over which is better as a player, where my gut says that Jesse is probably a bit more repeatable, where I feel like Jesse would probably do better on more appearances compared to Carson. But I still think what separates Jesse and Carson from me is that I think Carson was still a bit more well-rounded on his particular season. And I think Carson also faced a little more adversity compared to Jesse, where I feel like what separates Carson is that Carson actually had a trade swap where he was swapped over to the Ratus, and while that should have put him in a bad spot, where even though he had an idol, he was still the only person to come over, he was still able to build pretty good bonds with a lot of people there, to where he was essentially in the middle of that tribe, to where had they ever gone to tribal, he would have been pretty safe there. And beyond that, I feel like Carson's navigation of the game is still pretty strong, where he was obviously in a pretty good spot in the original Tika group and was able to be in the middle for those first couple of rounds. After the merge, he was able to reconnect with Carolyn and Yam Yam. From that point, be able to run the game, where he and Yam Yam were able to work side by side for a lot of it. And I think Carson was probably more the brains behind the operation, where I feel like Carson was the one who was leading more the strategy compared to Yam Yam for a lot of it. But even beyond that, Carson was a bit better physically compared to Jesse, where Carson at least won an immunity along the way. I feel like that's pretty good. And he also had a clearer path to the end in my eyes, where while Carson did face a little bit of adversity at the final 7, he wasn't going home in that spot anyway. But even at the final 4, like, he was in a spot to where Yam Yam was going to take him to the end, where Yam Yam wanted an all-Tika final 3, and had Carson gotten that, he wins the game, where we know that Carson would have beaten both Carolyn and Yam Yam, also beats Heidi. So I feel like Carson had a much clearer path to the win, though obviously gets unfortunate by Heidi winning immunity instead and taking him on in fire. So I still think Carson demonstrated a lot of skills for the game across his one season. And while I don't like Carson very much, and I wish I could put Jesse above him, I feel like it's that fact that puts him one spot higher for me, which is why he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we're actually wrapping up the people who are on the original list, and here we have Yam Yam, the winner of Survivor 44. And Yam Yam actually moved up compared to his placement on the original list, compared to the people who were on the original list. And while I still think Yam Yam has plenty of shortcomings as a player, I still think he is a very good all-around player, where I feel like he is very good socially, where we see him building so many connections over the course of the season, and also does a pretty decent job of managing his threat level, where the only times he's truly targeted in the game are at points where he's put on the bottom due to measures outside of his control, namely that split tribal that happens right after the merge. But beyond that, he's in a pretty good spot beyond that, where he's able to play the middle alongside Carson for a lot of it. And I feel like for someone like Yam Yam to get through a lot of the game in the majority without being targeted, despite him being this pretty big personality and someone who should be coming off as this big threat, is really impressive in my eyes. And I feel like Yam Yam was someone who had a lot of win equity on that season, where he beats almost everyone on the board, and the only person he loses to is Carson, which is a problem considering he wanted to go to the end with Carson and was only thwarted by the fact that Heidi won Final Immunity. But even then, he was trying to help Carson practice in fire. So I do think Yam Yam has at least some shortcomings strategically, where he wanted to have an Altika Final 3, where I feel like there were so many other paths he could have taken that would have ensured his win at the end. And I do think Yam Yam benefited a lot from having someone like a Carson that could help him navigate the game strategically. Though at the same time, I still think he is a fan of the show. He understands the game well enough to where he can navigate just based off his social ability. Though at the same time, I do think the strategic shortcomings is a reason why he's not higher on the list. But I still look at Yam Yam as an all-around strong player, definitely one of the better players of the new era, and it's for that reason that he is here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and for me this top 4 is pretty definitive, and it was just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, we have someone who I think a lot of people are down on after seeing how their season ended, but I still look at this person as a very solid player, and here we have Austin from Survivor 45. And I feel like some people really sleep on Austin, considering that he ended up falling in love with Dee, and through that definitely guided some of his decision making. Though at the same time, I still look at Austin as a very strong all-around player, where I feel like he's good physically, he's good socially, he's pretty good strategically, though obviously has some missteps along the way. But I feel like Austin is someone who I just have a lot of confidence in on any given season. And we see the play out in 45 where he plays a very strong game, where he's in the majority right at the bat in the original Reba. He builds all these connections with the likes of Dee and Drew that's able to keep him pretty safe there. After the swap, he's able to pull Emily to his side, which I find pretty impressive, especially considering that Kendra had spent time with Emily during the first round, and also you have Drew kind of pushing some people away. The fact that Austin's able to pull Emily in is all very impressive play there. And then after the merge, he's part of this dominant alliance. He's able to run a lot of the game. And he's never really targeted during the game either, which I also find pretty impressive, where at least before the final 7, I would say that Austin's probably one of the best positioned people in the entire game, where he's obviously within the Reba 4, but even within the Reba 4, he has the closest connection to Emily and Drew, but also has a very strong bond with Dee, to where Dee was probably never turning on him. And I feel like Austin was pretty well situated there, and was even part of this plan at the final 7 to blindside Julie. That is until he decides to tell Dee about the plan, due to him having such a strong connection to Dee, to where he didn't want to blindside her, which is obviously a shortcoming to his game and really causes that plan to unravel, to where Julie is eventually able to idle out Emily, which really weakens his position there. And then he's on the outs the following round where he loses Drew, and I feel like he ends up really letting go of his central position within the Reba 4, to where it seems like he kind of has to go all in on Dee at this point, when to his credit, Dee does want to take him to the end, which is pretty good. And even then, I still think he plays the last few rounds all right, where I feel like at the final 5, he's probably one of the few people that is thinking straight during that round, which I had to give him some credit for there. But even at the final 3, when he's up against Dee, who is this massive jury threat, he still is able to hold his own, to where he gets 3 jury votes there, one of which being Kendra, who he flips at final tribal. So even though he does technically lose to Dee at the end, and to his fault, he did want to take Dee to the end, he was still competitive in that final 3, which I had to give him at least some credit for. And I feel like Austin played a very impressive game on his season, definitely one of the best non-winning games of the new era. And I feel like Austin's someone who is just very good at all 3 aspects of the game, to where I feel like he would do well almost every single time that he plays. Though at the same time, the reason he's not higher is he still does make that mistake towards the end of the game. He does still lose the game. And again, I feel like compared to people we're about to be talking about, I feel like they're probably a step above him, which is why he's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone from Austin's season and a person who I mentioned not too long ago, and here we have D, the winner of Survivor 45. And D is someone who I always knew was going to make the top 10. I feel like she played a very impressive winning game on her season. Though at the same time, I think when assessing her as a player, while I think she's a very strong player, and I feel like she played a very dominant game, I still think there are some faults to her as a player that make me hesitate putting her higher, where I think she is a bit too loyal in the game, and she's definitely prone to making emotional decisions, where you have the Sean Edwards tribal, where Sean ends up quitting the game, but despite knowing that Sean was going home, she still votes for Sifu for some reason, which I feel like was pretty unnecessary and definitely could have blown up in her face, where Sifu was pretty sus of her moving forward. And while she does good work to get around that and throws J Maya under the bus, I still feel like that was suboptimal play there. But obviously the major flaw to her game is the final 5, where she almost goes home due to her unwillingness to vote for Julie, where she wanted to keep Julie around, and through her being unwilling to vote for Julie, it opens it up for her to almost be sniped out of the game and is saved by stuff completely outside of her control, where Couture ends up voting for Julie due to her not trusting Jake, due to Jake kind of botching up his own plan. So there's that. And while Couture said afterwards that she was also swayed by D getting emotional during that tribal, I can't really give D any credit for that, as I don't think D was really aiming for that. She was just genuinely emotional in that tribal. So I do feel like D has his emotional streak that can definitely harm her game at certain points. And I think I should also mention Final Tribal, where the fact that she only wins in a 5-3 vote is definitely a knock against her, especially compared to other people who won in a more dominant fashion. And also losing Kendra's vote Final Tribal is also not a great look in my eyes. But if we're taking that stuff out, I still think D is a very strong player, where I feel like she's very good physically, she's very good socially, and she's competent enough strategically, though, again, has her emotional streak along the way, where I feel like she plays a very impressive game, where, like Austin, she is in the majority lines from very early on, is able to control the game for so much of it. You get to the final 7, where she has such a good bond with Austin, to where Austin feels the need to tell her about this plan to blindside Julie when it made no sense for him to do so. So I did give D a lot of credit for that, and is really able to play that situation to her favor, where she tells Julie about the plan, telling her to play her idol and idling out Emily in the process, and really just putting herself in a pretty strong position moving forward. And again, I feel like D is someone who, very similar to Austin, I feel like D is someone who I would have a lot of confidence in on any given season. And I'll definitely be curious to see how she does in Survivor 50. So at the end of the day, it makes sense why she's very high on this list. The reason she's not higher, though, is I still have those knocks against her. The fact that I still think she's a bit too loyal in the game, and we have seen it working to her detriment during the game. And I feel like it's those things that kind of hold me back from having her higher, even though I still think she's a very strong player. So it's for that reason she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I very much debated with these top 2. I feel like these are 2 pretty strong players. I feel like they demonstrate a lot of skills for the game, and obviously both of them played good games on their season. And it really was a question of ordering them. And I went back and forth, and I'm sure even then some people will be unhappy with this placement. But number 2, I did decide to go with Kyle, the winner of Survivor 48, and I didn't really know what to make of Kyle, as I feel like on one hand, he is a player that definitely demonstrated a lot of skills for the game, where I feel like he is pretty well-rounded, pretty good physically, pretty good socially, and someone who I think understands the strategy of the game well enough to where we see him navigating the game pretty well. And I feel like his winning game, while not the most dominant in the world, is still one where he's able to navigate pretty effectively, where he is initially in the majority group on the original Sivas. He obviously gets a pretty bad swap and does need an idol to get through that round, which obviously is a knock against him, but I still feel like him and Camila demonstrate some good play within that. And I feel like after the merge, he's able to be pulled into the new majority alliance that's able to ride the table moving forward. And I feel like the fact that Kyle had all these connections to the likes of David, at least until David blew up, also with Camila, obviously, and even more so with Joe and Eva, to where Joe and Eva were always planning to take Kyle very deep into the game, despite Kyle being someone who is clearly a threat to win the game. And the fact that Kyle is able to play the middle so effectively without also having a major target on his back is pretty good in my eyes. And while I don't think he drove a lot of the actual votes, and we definitely saw him being in a couple tricky spots along the way, I still feel like Kyle navigated through the game pretty well. And I think the fact that he ends up winning at the end against both Joe and Eva is also pretty good in my eyes. So I think there's definitely a lot to like with Kyle's game. Though with that said, I still have some reservations, where I'm still not entirely sure about how intentional Kyle's endgame was, where while we do see him going up against Joe and Eva, who were pretty known to not be the most well respected by the jury, I'm still not sure if Kyle was intentionally dragging Joe and Eva to the end or not. Where I feel like even from his exit interview, like while you would assume that Kyle was dragging Joe and Eva to the end under the guise that they were these shields for him, but also these goats that he could be at the end, I also get the sense that a lot of it was due to him just genuinely having like this very strong connection to Joe and not wanting to turn on him. So I do question how intentional his endgame approach was, and I feel like his exit interviews didn't really give me a clear answer on that. And on top of that, while he does beat Joe and Eve at the end, he was also very close to getting to the end with Camila, who we know now would have beaten Kyle at the end. And yes, while I think Kyle probably would have cut Camila anyway, even if Camila didn't tell him that she would have cut him, the fact that Camila comes one round away and one challenge win away from beating him at the end is also a little bit questionable. So sort of similar to D, I think Kyle has this emotional side to him and has this really strong loyalty to his own allies in the game. And while we didn't see it harm his game to the same extent that it harmed D's game, I still think the fact that it's there and the fact that Kyle never clarifies how intentional his strategy of taking Joe and Eva to the end was makes it open that he could have this similar issue happen again. And while he ended up being right in beating Joe and Eva at the end, I could see a world where he ends up doing a similar thing, but this time with someone who could beat him, and he ends up losing because of that. So while I think Kyle is a pretty strong all-around player, while he is a winner of the show, and while I think he definitely has potential to move up on a player ranking on the return here on Survivor 50, I think it's those unanswered questions and these potential downsides that make me hesitate with having him at number 1. So it's for that reason that even though I still think he's a very good player and while I think he could definitely move up in the future, I'm going to leave him behind here at number 2. And now at number 1, the best player of the new era after Survivor 48 is someone who I'm sure some people will be unhappy with me having this person at number 1, especially with this person being a non-winner. However, I still think this person is a very well-rounded player and someone who still played a very impressive game on their season. At number 1, we have Charlie from Survivor 46. And I still stand by what I said about Charlie in my runner-up ranking. I think Charlie is a very strong player of the game, where he's pretty good physically, pretty good socially, pretty good strategically. And while he obviously loses at the end in a spot to where Kyle won his season, I think Charlie is a bit of a better version of Kyle in my eyes, where I feel like he still has the skills that Kyle has, where we see him being in a very good position for almost the entire game. He rides the middle, he builds his very strong connection with Maria right at the bat, is able to control his original tribe. After the merge, he's able to essentially become part of the new majority alliance, and also someone that's able to remain pretty safe during a lot of the game. But I think what separates Charlie from Kyle is that I feel like there are more points where Charlie blatantly gets his way compared to Kyle, where I feel like Charlie is more responsible for a lot of the vote outs that happen there, and also clearly outplays Maria on multiple opportunities that really allow him to come into the endgame in a much stronger position compared to Maria. He obviously ends up keeping Q around to be the smoke screen. He also blindsides multiple people with idols in their pocket, which I still find pretty funny. And at the same time, I think Charlie also has a killer instinct where he recognizes that Maria is someone who would probably beat him at the end, and through that is able to pull the trigger on Maria before Maria can pull the trigger on him, which I feel like is a massive pro to him over Kyle. And while he does technically lose at the end, it's still in a spot to where he was very competitive, where he ended up getting 3 votes of Final Tribal, and really came down to factors that I don't think were entirely in Charlie's control, where for one, you have the fact that Kenzie has this really sympathetic backstory of her like struggling and needing the money more. Also the fact that Kenzie was the one to go into fire making in a spot to where a lot of the jury seemed to respect that. In a spot to where Charlie was actually saved by fire due to the fact that he had a better connection to Ben. So it's sort of this weird spot to where the fact that Charlie outplayed Kenzie at the Final 4 in securing a spot at the end is what causes him to lose respect, which he couldn't entirely account for. And then also the fact that Maria doesn't vote for him in a spot to where Maria had told him right before being voted out that she would vote for him and seemed to change her mind after the fact. So I do feel like Charlie was someone who played a very dominant game while still coming extremely close to winning at the end, to where had he got Maria's vote, he wins the season. So I still stand by Charlie playing a very strong runner-up game across the season. And I also think Charlie's someone who can play a very repeatable game, where I feel like Charlie's someone who I would have a lot of faith in coming into any given season, and I would expect him to do reasonably well on Survivor 50, though we'll have to see how that plays out. But I feel like Charlie is someone who is on a similar level to Kyle in terms of him being this very well-rounded player, someone who played a very impressive game. But I feel like it's those minor things, the fact that he still came pretty close to winning, and also the fact that he has his killer instinct is what elevates him for me over Kyle. So it's for that reason that I have him here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I might make more of these general Survivor videos during the off season, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.